So we'll start with the next session. And once more, again, thank you to Professor Ragini Parikh, Dr. Himalini Samant, and our young doctor from Aurangabad for putting this all together. So can I start?
Thank you, Dr. Parikshit. I'll just interrupt you. The dynamic president of the MOS, Dr. Parikshit Bhai, and I won't interrupt him, but I just would like to give him a big hand of applause.
Thank you, ma'am. There is a small request from Dr. Manjushri Bhate that she had wanted to speak earlier, for which Dr. Zai Kelkar has kindly consented, so we can just swap their talks. And may I start?
All yours, sir.
Yeah. Can you see my screen on strabismus resurgery?
Yes, sir. Sir, I'm Dr. Shruti. And
hi, Dr. Shruti.
Yeah, hello, sir. So
hi.
I'll be moderating this session. So
great, thank you, Doctor. So please
yeah.
Point out if I am overshooting time. I'll try to make
sir.
up. And this is actually a talk that should be right at the end of the session because I have to do something again at 4 o'clock. They were kind enough to put me earlier.
Excellent,
well,
sir.
for strabismus resurgeries, why do we do a resurgery? Well, as ophthalmologists or as any surgeons, nobody likes resurgeries because that means something not perfect had happened in the first. So we have to do it again. But then resurgeries are there if we have a planned 2-step procedure where one step was done earlier and now it's the second step. Or in cases of a slipped or lost muscle in which the MR is the commonest lost and perhaps the LR is the commonest slipped. And in strabismus, we do see abandoned surgeries when somebody else has attempted a surgery but somehow could not go ahead, and then we have to deal with it. Very rarely we come across a wrong diagnosis, especially an accommodative component of esotropia that was missed. And I'm sure all of us must have seen at least a case in our career. Or a wrong operative technique, that is, the surgeon started wrongly or strayed midway during the surgery. Or an intermittent exotropia that was operated very early in life and later has become esotropia. Or sensory strabismus, when, of course, the eyes don't stay straight. Or resurgery is also there in restrictive strabismus, when it is difficult to accurately calculate the dose-response relationship, like in dysthyroid ophthalmopathy, secondary to trauma in paralytic squints. Well, resurgeries are common. But what we have to understand is almost 60% of strabismic surgeries will have a post-operative deviation of more than 10 prism diopters a decade after surgery. And this is data from the American Academy of Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus in both exotropia and esotropia. And as we are operating children earlier and earlier in life, perhaps in the first half of the first decade, well, we are going to have some kind of a resurgery when the child is in the second decade. So the need for a repeat strabismus surgery is not uncommon. So, well, when do we do it? In undercorrections of up to less than 10 prism diopters, it is still acceptable because peripheral fusion is possible, but anything more than that would need a resurgery. In young children less than 4 years, a larger undercorrection negates the indication for surgery. An overcorrection of up to 8 diopters may be accepted, but more than that usually lands up in a problem. Well, to prevent something like this from happening, the refraction must be checked and rechecked before we are operating the patient. An amblyopia treatment must be completely done. An orthoptic evaluation must be done properly. And well, if we are doing it, then a force duction test is a must because there, after the first surgery, some restrictions, some adhesions may have developed. The surgical plan is to be drawn and the patient is to be counseled. So everything that we do for a primary surgery and some things even more and more diligently. So in esotropia surgeries, recess resect surgeries have lesser chances of undercorrection than bilateral medial rectus surgeries. If initially a bilateral MR recess is done, we could do a MR marginal myotomy or a LR resection or a bilateral LR resection. If there is an undercorrection of esotropia, If it's 20 to 30 prism diopters of undercorrection, then for one eye, we can do MR marginal myotomy with LR resect. With a much larger one, 30 to 50 prism diopters, both eyes marginal myotomy with resect. And of course, if it's more than 50 prism diopters, we will need a three muscle surgeries. If there is an overcorrection of esotropia, and God forbid, we have had a secondary exotropia, well, we have to think of the Cooper's dictum is to plan and execute the second surgery as if the patient has never had previous surgery. Again, for the treatment of overcorrection, do not reverse the original surgery. If ET has become XT, do not undo MR recess, LR resect, rather do the other eye, LR recess. Because every time we are touching the same muscle, there are chances that there'll be more adhesions and we are not sure of our dose-response relationship. If the overcorrection is less than 10 prism diopters, peripheral fusion takes care of it. In fact, small overcorrections can lead to faster reappearance of normal retinal correspondence. So when to reoperate? If it's cosmetically undesirable overcorrection of more than 12 to 15 prism diopters, we can tackle it after 8 weeks. But if it is in the immediate post-op period and a lost or a slipped muscle is suspected by a sudden, large, often consecutive strabismus, then early intervention is beneficial. The sooner you do, the better it is. The usual equation changes. The dose-response relationship is difficult to predict. Adjustable sutures can be a great help, but then they need skill and patience on part of the surgeon and faith and cooperation on part of the patient. So even that is very, very important if we are thinking of adjustable sutures. They definitely improve chances of good outcome. So, I mean, almost 90% good outcome we can get. But there is a need for short general anesthesia for adjustment in children and uncooperative adults. And the adjustment has to be done on the second post-operative day. So there is a randomized controlled trial from Guru Nanak Eye Center, Delhi, which shows no significant difference if we do adjustable and non-adjustable. But another RCT from KGMC Lucknow and Venu Delhi has found modified adjustable sutures to be more predictable. But then in thyroid-related strabismus, people have even tried weak magnetic fields, scleral implants to help deal with whatever is the improper correction rather than doing direct resurgery. Sometimes we may need a horizontal rectus muscle transplantation, a long-term follow-up, of course, is needed for this. But the main pitfall in resurgeries, the normal anatomy is disturbed, and identifying the muscles needs experience and patience, and be prepared for surprises. Again, if in doubt, it is better to grade the surgery to tackle one or two muscles at a time rather than attempting multiple muscle resurgery. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a really interesting talk, and you covered all aspects of resurgeries in general. Dr. Gogate, I think I couldn't introduce earlier. He needs no introduction, sir. Is the president of MOS, and he's a gold medalist in MS Hospital, and sir is currently doing private practice in Dr. Gogte's eye clinic and has several publications to his credit, and his main interest is cataract, pediatric ophthalm, and community ophthalmology, in which he has done an MSc. Sir, excellent presentation, sir. Just a small question. Do you see any difference after surgery in cases when you have to go back and re-recess a muscle, for example, medial rectus? Do you see the deviation, the dosage change, the MM that we get, the PD correction that we get per muscle? Do you feel there is a change, sir?
There is a change. We can never be sure of the exact correction. So that is why if more than one muscle needs to be tackled, I would prefer to grade it. If it's an adult and if they are willing, then doing an adjustable sutures, this is perhaps the best technique that is there. But in India, of course, if we give general anesthesia, then, it has its own this. So you can't post a child for GA today for surgery, again, a short GA tomorrow for doing it again. So there you have to counsel the parents. But mercifully, I have only on 2 occasions have had to do a resurgery on a child, and that was operated somewhere else a couple of years earlier. But with adults, it is there. And as I think you grow in practice and as your hair get more and more white, and you've been in it, you see that resurgeries are not that uncommon. Earlier, we used to think that it's very rare to have a resurgery. That's not the case.
Right. So thank you so much. We'll now have Dr. Manjushri Bhate with, for the second presentation as requested by Professor Gupte. So Dr. Manjushri is one of the finest pediatric ophthalmologists from India. She has completed her training in pediatric ophthalmology from Children's Hospital in Westmead, Sydney, under Dr. Frank Martin and team. And she has also done a short-term training from Akron's Children's Hospital in the USA. Dr. Bhate brings with her a vast and varied experience and has worked in John Hunter's Children's Hospital in New South Wales. And she is currently the associate ophthalmologist at LVPI, and her special interests are pediatric cataracts, strabismus, genetics, and pediatric neuro-ophthalmology. We welcome you, ma'am, and it's an honor to have you here with us today. She will be talking to us on thyroid strabismus. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. And can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello?
Yes, we can, ma'am. We can hear you. We can see your slides as well.
Thank you. You might hear some background banging noise because of some construction, so I apologize for that. And I'd like to thank the organizers and Himalini and Parikshit Gupte for giving me this opportunity to present at this session. So we'll go straight to the talk. It's on thyroid strabismus, and it's a vast topic, but I've tried to keep things very short and simple. So as we know, thyroid eye disease is an autoimmune inflammatory disease of the orbital tissues. And here, as you can see, is the Rundle curve, which basically talks of the timeline in a thyroid eye disease. So the initial active thyroid phase, and later on the chronic or the fibrotic phase. So this usually goes on for about 24 to 30 months. The most important principle in thyroid eye disease is first is to control the active disease. So this can be done with the help of either systemic steroids, oral or intravenous, irradiation, monoclonal antibodies, and there's a lot of new interest in teprotumab, which is one of the newer monoclonal antibodies. And also we need to advise lifestyle modifications to the patients. Then we come to treating the sequelae of the thyroid eye disease, which involves correcting the orbital deformities in the form of orbital decompression. More so, this becomes urgent if there is any optic nerve compression at the apex. Then looking at the eye muscles, so treating the strabismus, and then is the eyelid. So this is best managed with a multidisciplinary team approach. Coming specifically to strabismus and thyroid eye disease, it approximately happens in a smaller percentage of patients. And in India, we see much lesser strabismus and thyroid eye disease, I would say, as compared to the Western world. Then all the muscles could be involved, and it's very often asymmetric. The common muscles is the inferior rectus, the medial, and the superior rectus involvement. And we usually see these patients as they present with diplopia, abnormal head posture, or sometimes with all additional psychosocial issues as well. The aim of managing the strabismus is mainly to give the patient a comfortable field of binocular single vision, both in primary as well as in down gaze, and give him a good cosmesis. So with these in mind, we just come to a few examples. So to begin, first of all, our ocular motility workup needs to also match the MRI findings. As you can see over here, this patient has got a very large hypertrophy of the right eye. And when we match up with the MRI of the orbits, we can see these massive extraocular muscles, and the largest being the right superior rectus over here, which is straight away pulling the eye up. So it's important to collaborate the radiology as well as the clinical evaluation. So when we come to managing the non-surgical aspect, that is treating the patient if it's a reasonably small angle with prisms, Fresnel prisms are generally preferred more than ground glass because the angles may keep changing as the thyroid eye disease varies with the progression in the course. Then optical, so we can keep separate distance and reading glasses. Botox, this is used a little sparingly in thyroid eye disease, but does have a role, and monocular occlusion. Um, Looking at the surgical management, so we need to basically make sure that the angle is stable before considering surgery. And in as far as surgical management is concerned, there are some controversies when it comes to the surgical management. So one is whether the patient should be operated under GA or LA. So this depends on the systemic condition of the patient. Then the choice of sutures. So there are I would say groups which are believers or non-believers of adjustable sutures, and some who prefer absorbable or over non-absorbable sutures. Personally, I prefer a vicryl suture, a hangback technique, and if it's a horizontal muscle, then use an adjustable suture technique, not for the inferior rectus or vertical muscles. So let's look at a few examples. So this is a 56-year-old patient. He's a businessman, and he's had his thyroid eye disease, which has been stable for more than 1 year. So he had a decompression of his right orbit, and his strabismus and diplopia got much worse. Following that, he just refused to have an orbital decompression for the left eye, and all he wanted was strabismus surgery. And the MRI images confirmed the enlarged muscles in both the orbits. So this is his pre-op assessment. As you can see, he's got a large right hypertropia and also reasonable right esotropia as well. He does have limitation of elevation of the left eye additionally. And so this patient then underwent a surgical procedure. He underwent a stage procedure, a superior rectus recession on hangback, almost to the tune of 12 to 13 millimeters, and also a right medial rectus recession. Post-operatively, there was a significant improvement in his cosmetic alignment and also with regards to his diplopia. And now he's cruising along with prisms. And again, as I said, he just refuses to have any orbital decompression for the left eye. He's not as much bothered with his cosmesis now. Next, we come to this patient, Mr. XY. So he basically again was stable on and well controlled. He was not advised orbital decompression because it was not necessary, but he had already had a previous extraocular muscle surgery, and he had already had Botox in the left inferior rectus. Despite all this, he had a left hypertropia of about 40 diopters, and also limitation of elevation, as you can see over here, of the left eye, and some limitation of abduction of the left eye. So he again underwent radiological imaging to confirm the bulky extraocular muscles, as we can see here, and then underwent a superior rectus recess of the right eye and an inferior rectus re-recession of the left eye. This was just to balance the defect. And so he was happy, and ortho in primary position does have some double vision while looking down, for which he uses prisms. He may need a lower lid retractor repair later if at all he is concerned about that. So I'm just going to go through one more example just to sort of just reiterate that it is a complex strabismus and it needs to be individualized and tailor-made. So this patient had multiple systemic issues. He was diabetic, hypertensive. He had some heart issues as well. He had a stent. He was diagnosed elsewhere with the thyroid eye disease and has been managing his diplopia with patching for 1.5 years. And he had a left hypertropia of about 35 prism diopters, otherwise stable, and underwent strabismus surgery with again balancing the defect with the right superior rectus and the left inferior rectus. This patient underwent surgery on adjustable sutures and is doing reasonably well. So just to conclude, so strabismus in thyroid eye disease is challenging, and the patients can be managed without surgery as well. with surgery, we need to delay until things are stable. And at the time of surgery, it's important to relieve the restrictions, make intraoperative changes to the surgical plan if required. And teprotumumab this may change the way we manage thyroid eye disease in the future. So this would be probably a game changer to look out for. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a very interesting talk. Please excuse the sound in my background as well. There is a construction going on. So you rightly said that there is requires to be tailor-made. Each patient is different. Have you had any experiences where you have had a recurrence of the thyroid disease after the surgery? You know, if there's an uncontrolled thyroid, do they recur? Does the hypertropia recur?
I've had very few patients who have shown some recurrence and some worsening of their deviation after strabismus surgery, yes. And in those cases, I would tend to repeat the MRI because sometimes there can be newer muscles that could be affected. And more often I've had, I wouldn't say often, but in some cases I've had these patients who've come with oblique muscles being affected then. And in that case, it becomes quite challenging to then try and, help their deviation. So again, it just depends on an individual case as to how that can be tackled. But that's not something which is totally unheard of. It does happen in a few patients, yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for that. We will have the panel discussion in the end. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Zai Kelkar. Dr. Zai Kelkar is practicing in Pune. She's she's a director of Kelkar Eye Institute, the National Institute of Ophthalmology. She has done her pediatric ophthalmology fellowship from the University Hospital at Ghent in Belgium. She has several publications to her credit. We welcome you, ma'am. And she will be talking to us today about monocular elevation deficit, another interesting strabismus entity that we see in our OPD.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Always nice to be a part of MOSCON. I must especially congratulate Parikshit Gupte sir, Lahane sir and Lagini madam for the seamless coordination of this conference. It's not easy to be doing a state level conference on the online platform. So kudos to you. With this, I start my talk. It's on monocular elevation deficit. So as you know, MED was originally called the double elevator palsy, but now it is defined as the limitation of elevation of the affected eye from any position of gaze with normal reductions in all other gazes. So only the up gaze is affected, and it is more accurate than the double elevator palsy because it encompasses everything like the isolated superior rectus palsy, the inferior rectus restrictions, and the supranuclear lesions as well. So what is the pathogenesis of MED? So superior rectus is the main muscle, as we all know, for elevation of the eye in adduction, abduction, or even the primary position. So in the presence of a normal superior rectus, the inferior rectus restriction can cause MED. Secondary contracture of the inferior rectus due to primary superior rectus palsy can also lead to MED. And Jampel and Fels suggested that unilateral supranuclear lesions in the pretectal area or inside the third cranial nerve can also cause MED. So it is characterized by three main clinical features. That's an elevation deficit, there can be ptosis or a pseudotosis, and Marcus-Gunn phenomenon also can be seen in about 25% of cases. So ptosis or pseudotosis is noticeable in more commonly noticeable when the normal eye fixates, and true ptosis may be present in about 25% of cases. So other features are that Bell's phenomenon is usually absent in cases of the inferior rectus restriction, which is expected because the inferior rectus is not allowing the eye to move up. Amblyopia also may be present if there's a constant deviation of the affected eye or if there's a associated true ptosis or anisometropia. Diplopia will be seen in cases which are acquired MED. It will be naturally absent in congenital cases of congenital onset. Abnormal head posture is also seen very frequently where the patient can present with a chin elevation. But again, there can be no abnormal head posture also if there is orthotropia in primary position of the affected eye or if the affected eye is amblyopic. There are three classifications of MEDs, type 1, 2, and 3. Type 1 includes patients with primary inferior rectus restriction or fibrosis. So they are often orthoptic in primary and the FDT is positive. In type 2, it's mainly the superior rectus palsy and the FDT here will be negative. While the type 3 is the supranuclear type, again the FDT is negative. So what are let's quickly consider the differential diagnosis. In the previous session, we have heard Kanade madam explain about Brown syndrome very nicely. So in Brown syndrome, the characteristic is that the elevation is limited only in adduction. Normal elevation in abduction as well as straight up is always present, so that differentiates it from Brown's. Vertical Duan syndrome is also possible, but of course this is pretty rare. Then congenital absence of the superior rectus or the inferior oblique can also mimic, but these will be associated with craniofacial anomalies. Congenital fibrosis of the extraocular muscles, or CFEOM, can also affect the inferior rectus initially, and this can be confused with MED in the earlier cases. But bilateral presentation, involvement of the other extraocular muscles are the features which will help us to distinguish it. The most difficult part to distinguish is the third nerve palsy, because third nerve palsy may simulate the findings of MED, but abnormal pupillary reactions if present, again, they clinch the diagnosis towards the third nerve palsy. But a palsy of the superior division of the third nerve, which affects the superior rectus and the levator muscle, is very difficult if present to distinguish from the MED. So what is the management? Like in every case, management is medical and surgical. So correction of the underlying refractive error is of prime importance. As soon as we see a case of MED, we don't directly jump to surgery. First look at the refractive error. Amblyopia, if present, should be treated provided the lid is allowing you to do patching for the other eye. And then, of course, surgery will be indicated. So indications of surgery are significant vertical deviation in primary gaze, significant abnormal head posture, deviation-induced amblyopia, diplopia in primary gaze, or restricted binocular fields. Goal of surgery is to improve all that and improve the position of the affected eye. Well, you cannot bring it perfectly, but if you can get it into ortho position in the primary gaze, that serves the purpose for the patient. And this is what should be explained to the parents when we take up the patients for surgery. This is a very nice chart that I found in the DOS Times. If you have MED, FDT is the thing which will help you decide how you want to proceed with the procedure. If the FDT is positive, then naturally the inferior rectus is tight, so that the inferior rectus needs to be tackled first. In cases where if the inferior rectus is not restricted, then you can think about NAP surgery. Again, this chart is very useful, available on the internet also. And depending upon the degree of deviation, you can go on making changes to your surgical plan. So you can go on adding a few procedures. So let's look at the NAPS procedure. It is the commonly practiced procedure, well-established treatment. And the main idea is that you shift the tendons of the medial rectus and the lateral rectus to the superior rectus. Let's see this in a video. So an FDT is very important. So you see if the inferior rectus is weak or tight. So as you see, it was the medial rectus, you hook the muscle, secure the muscle, and then disinsert it. Same procedure is being done for the lateral rectus. This is the superior rectus muscle. Hook the muscle. I feel you should keep that small bridge of conjunctiva intact so that the healing of the conjunctiva is very good. It helps reduce the fibrosis. So the muscles close to the insertion of the superior rectus. You don't have to actually suture it to the superior rectus. That helps us with the helps us avoiding the anterior segment ischemia syndrome. So with both the knots, make sure that you are passing it through the sclera and securing them close to the insertion of the superior rectus muscle. Do not want, because the sclera is very thin near the insertion of the muscles, it is better that you hold the muscle with the superior rectus forceps. Again, an FDT after the conclusion of surgery will tell you whether the muscle has, the eye is now, if it's a negative FDT or not. So this is one of few cases that this girl had a MED pre-operative, and this is the post-NAP procedure. She will now undergo a ptosis surgery, but you can see that the eye is now orthotropic. The hypotropia of the left eye has reduced after the NAPS procedure. This guy presented with a MED.
Madam,
And
sorry to interrupt, madam. The time is
NAPS procedure. This is a post-operative video.
It's a beautiful video.
Have a look at the literature review quickly. So there are a few problems with the NAPS procedure also. So we should know how much the NAPS procedure is able to correct. what exactly the effect of transposition surgery will have, how will the corrections go on reducing over time. So remember that there's no grading in the correction of naps. A large variability in the amount of correction is obtained with this procedure, and there's a tendency to drift outwards with time. So the augmented naps is the procedure for choice and gives superior results. In augmented naps, you just put a posterior fixation suture on the horizontal recess. And they've done a series of 14 patients and the results have been very good. Again, same, Cooper and all also have said that the NAPS procedure, while useful, you have to be very careful. And if also horizontal deviation is present, you better correct the horizontal deviation in the other eye rather than doing this in the same eye. So to conclude, MED is a challenging condition. Management of amblyopia should not be overlooked. NAPS is the procedure of choice, though it should be taken with complete understanding of how the procedure will work for that given patient. And the treatment is multi-staged. Proper counseling of the parents about the outcome is very essential. Thank you very much.
Thank you, madam. Excellent videos and excellent way of approach. Especially love the flow chart that you were able to show. Gave a very clear way of how to observe the surgical management for such entities. Dr. Manjushri, would you like to add? Maybe you have any comment or question? Anyone from the panel who would like to comment on this?
Shruti, do you do Nishidas or do you do naps for MED?
I still do naps, ma'am, but Nishidas is something that's coming up, but I still prefer to do naps.
Is there any particular reason?
No particular reason. It's just that I'm more comfortable with the
because
procedure.
that's the only surgery we know for sure.
Yeah, we're more comfortable with that
Hospital.
procedure. Yeah, exactly. So that's what. But Nishidas is coming up as a very promising thing. So definitely we should be trying that out. Do you have any experience, ma'am, with Nishidas?
So I've done both. And personally, I also prefer naps. I find Nishidas sometimes a little difficult, because unless your dissection is very neat and clean and deep, it's very difficult to really actually pull the muscles. It's not as easy as being discussed in conferences.
Right.
Particularly when muscles are tight.
Yes, ma'am. And I also feel augmentation with the naps gives a much better effect as well. So many a time I do end up giving an augmentation suture too.
Have you ever had an overcorrection with your naps?
No. Almost always I do feel that we cannot go wrong. There's always an undercorrection.
Never an overcorrection.
Never an overcorrection.
I mean, just about 7-8 of them so far, but never over.
Correct.
Yeah.
We'll go on to the next talk, Shruti.
Himalini, can I interrupt you for a second? Just a second.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Manjusha ji. Thank you, Zai. And thank you, Himalini. I must mention over here that Himalini for so many years has been doing the squint and the neuro-ophthalmology and the pediatric sessions, and a wonderful feast in terms of the speakers and everybody who are present here today. And I would like to thank all of you, Shruti, for conducting this so well, Dr. Kavita, and everybody present here today for your time. And thank you, the lovely Himalini, for the sessions you plan, and you are so perfect at doing it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
I needed to say.
Thank you, ma'am, for your kind
And
words.
Parikshit Gopte for being the ever supportive, the calm, and the helpful president.
Shruti and Hemant, can I make a comment about the previous about overcorrection of naps?
Yes, ma'am.
I think we should have a little word of caution in that. See, when we have done an inferior rectus recession first and we follow with the naps procedure, especially full tendon nap if we're doing, there is definite chance or risk for an overcorrection. We have had patients who have really had at least 20-25 prisms of hypertrophy, because naps also has a time effect over time. Immediately it may appear fine, but so it's a very strong surgery, very effective surgery. But yes, there is a small risk, but yes, there is a risk, especially when we.
So you prefer half tendon? You prefer half tendon?
Not always. But if the deviation is more, what I'm saying is it's not that you cannot overcorrect.
Okay.
Yes.
We have had at least 2 patients in these years I have seen in a fellowship also and during consultancy also that there has been overcorrection. So just a little word of caution. That's it. So
Yes,
very
I think
important.
we'll need to do that many cases to reach to that point where we
Exactly.
start seeing the
Combined.
overcorrections.
Combined pool.
Yeah,
Anyway,
absolutely, madam.
thank you,
So
thank you.
experience speaks. Thank you, madam. Thank you for that comment. So I would like to invite Dr. Prachi Agashe for the next talk. Dr. Prachi is a very well-renowned pediatric ophthalmologist and squint surgeon. She has done a pediatric fellowship at Arvind Eye Hospital, Madurai, where I have done mine as well. I have done my PG there, and ROP fellowship at LVPI in Hyderabad, and she's currently doing her private practice at Agashe Hospital. She's a very dear friend and a colleague. I invite Dr. Prachi for the next talk on utility of Farden suture in squint. Over to you, Dr. Prachi.
Thank you, Shruti, for the kind introduction. And a big thank you to Hemalini Madam, Ragini Madam, and Gokte Sir to give me this opportunity. It's a real honor to be speaking in front of Gokte Sir because he has been my first teacher in ophthalmology right from my PG days. So it's great to be doing this presentation. Yeah, so I'll begin my talk. I have tried to keep it simple by trying to present a few cases where I have used this Farden suture. So let me just start off by a case presentation. So this was a 15-year-old boy who presented with upward deviation of the right eye following the trauma to the right eye with some bicycle handle. He gave history of some surgery being done with some tissue being excised. The details were not available. The best corrected visual acuity in the right eye was 612 and the left eye was 6.6. The deviations are as mentioned in the box. So there was a large hypertropia in primary position, and we can see that the depression was restricted to a very large extent. If we see closely, we can also see a bit of a lid retraction, which indicates that the inferior rectus was probably severe. A CT scan was done, which showed focal atrophy of the right inferior rectus near the insertion, while the distal portion was thinned out. So surgical planning was done to explore the muscles, resuture and to either resuture the IR if it was found, to probably do an inferior oblique anterior transpositioning to overcome the big hypertropia, or probably an inverse SNAPS procedure. So during the surgery, this was what was encountered. There was a big mass on blob that was there, which was just incomprehensible, and in spite of trying to do a lot of dissections, was not possible. The post-duction test for the superior rectus was negative, and hence an inverse full tendon NAPS procedure was done, where the medial and the medial rectus and the lateral rectus were sutured near the inferior rectus and augmented with the Foster's suture. 6 months post-operatively, this patient was doing well in primary position and up gaze. However, in down gaze, the patient was still symptomatic and not happy. So we can see that the down gaze incompetence still persisted with the hypertropia being there. I will leave this case halfway in between and move on to the next case and come back to it again. Moving on to the second case, this was a 6-year-old female presenting with squinting of right eye since childhood. The vision was slightly suboptimal in the right eye being 660 and left eye 618, which was the best corrected visual acuity. Now this child actually had a dissociated horizontal deviation in the right eye. So if we see undercover, the left eye moves less while the right eye drifts a lot. So that is the dissociated horizontal deviation. This was also confirmed with the reverse fixation test, wherein when doing the prism cover test, we see an abducting saccade in the eye with the DHD, while an adducting saccade is there in the eye under the prism. So basically there is some amount of incompetence that is present. Going on to the next case. So this is a 4-year-old child who presented with acute onset squinting of the left eye following an episode of fever. The visual acuity in the right eye was 612 and the left eye was 6/24. There was a hyperopic astigmatism. The child was put in a full plus correction. However, the esotropia still persisted, and there was a near distance disparity, with the near angle being much more than the distance by more than, with a difference of more than 10 prism diopters. The ET reduced with +3 glasses, and hence this was confirmatory of a high AC by A ratio. The patient underwent patching for a couple of months and then was planned for the surgical correction. So with these 3 cases kept halfway, I tried and introduced what Farden suture exactly is. So Farden in German means suture. It was first reported in 1912. It weakens the muscle in the field of the action without much slackening or alteration in primary position. So the principle on which this works is the muscle is sutured posterior to its insertion farther than the limit of its arc of contact. This shortens the lever arm and it reduces the momentum only when the eye rotates towards the muscle that is sutured. So to try and explain this, so this is actually the lever arm. So when in primary position, it is fully functional. When we put in a Farden suture, it is marginally affected when the eye is in the primary position. However, it gets affected significantly when the eye deviates or eye moves in the direction of the eye, in the direction where the Farden suture is applied, and this arm significantly reduces. It's usually combined with a recession. When you get a larger effect of the recession, it is best suited for medial rectus owing to its short arc of contact, however, can be done on any of the recti muscles. The various measurements for Farden are as enumerated. For medial rectus, it is 12 to 14 millimeters from the insertion. For lateral rectus, 17 to 19 millimeters. And for superior or inferior rectus, 14 to 16 millimeters from the insertion. Now let us come back to the cases. Coming back to case 1. So I left the case over here at 6 months post-operative, wherein this incompetence and down gaze persisted. So to encounter this, a left eye inferior rectus Farden procedure was done, and it worked very well. This was a primary position correction. This was a pre-op. This was at 6 months, and this is a 2 years post-operative. And now we can see that in down gaze, both the eyes are almost straight, and the down gaze diplopia had almost resolved. Coming to the second case of dissociated horizontal deviation, this girl underwent a lateral rectus recession with medial rectus resection, along with the Farden suture of the lateral rectus. So these are her videos. So if we see in the pre-operative video, we can see a large drift that is there under cover. At 1 month post-op, this reduces significantly in the alternate cover test. While at 3 years post-op, this correction is still maintained. A small DVD is sometimes manifested when she fixes at distance. And coming to the third case, this particular boy underwent both eyes medial rectus recession with Farden over the medial recti, and these are his results. So he was orthotropic at 3 months. The bifocals were then gradually just weaned off, and at 3 years post-op, he's just in his hyperopic glasses and is orthotropic with fusion. So these are the common indications where Farden sutures are done in accommodative esotropias with high AC by A ratio, in Graves' disease, in orbital trauma, in dissociated deviations, either dissociated vertical deviation or dissociated horizontal deviation, sometimes in pulley abnormalities, in nystagmus blockade syndrome with adduction nulls and 6-nerve palsies. So just to summarize, Farden suture is also known as posterior fixation suture surgery, used to weaken the rotational force of a rectus muscle when the eye rotates in the field of action of the Fardenized muscle. And it's a great procedure to address incompetent type of squints in particular cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prachi. It was a very interesting talk and a wonderful case presentations as well to exemplify that. I would just have one question for you. We do have a Scott's procedure as well, which is a recessed resect procedure. How do you compare this with the Fardens?
Can you just come again?
The Scott's procedure, the recessed resect procedure. Yeah.
So probably technically performing a Scott's procedure is probably easier. Yeah. But on an individual basis, I find it slightly difficult to, get the measurements right as to how much to exactly resect and to how much to exactly recess.
Yeah.
But yes, it has an advantage. Scott's, we can use an adjustable procedure to it, which cannot be done for Farden. So Scott's would score over that in certain situations.
And completely agree that Fardens might be a little difficult to reach out behind. And so there's an interesting technique, the adjustable, the modified Fardens.
By Dr. Manjula.
By Dr. Manjula, yeah.
For small
so that's an interesting technique as well. I've tried it and it works pretty well. So thank you, Dr. Prachi, for a wonderful talk. Any comments from the panel? Dr. Kavita would like to add anything?
Dr. Shruti, can I add a comment to this wonderful presentation by Dr. Prachi?
Thank you.
So this was in response to your question, comparing conventional Farden to Scott's procedure. Like Dr. Prachi said, you can adjust the Scott's procedure, which is not possible with the conventional Farden. Another drawback of the conventional Fadden, though, is that resurgeries are very difficult. If you have to go in and operate again, you will find that the muscle which is anterior to your Fadden suture has kind of fibrosed and necrosed and probably not functioning anymore. So resurgeries would be very difficult with a conventional Fadden, whereas Scott's procedure, you can operate as many times as you wish.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yes, sir, that's a good point. Thank you. So we'll go on. For the want of time, we are going to be rushing through the next presentation. So that we'll have Dr. Anand Kumar with us. Dr. Anand is a leading pediatric ophthalmologist based in Kharghar, Navi at Utsav Eye Clinic. He has completed his fellowship from Aravind Hospital, Madurai, and he's done a fellowship in strabismus and neuroophthalmology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison under the master, Dr. Burton Kushner himself. So we welcome you, sir, and sir will be talking on surgery of small angle strabismus. Very interesting topic. Over to you, sir. So, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Yeah.
I hope my slide is visible.
Yes, both. You're audible and visible, sir.
Okay, great. I too would want to thank the organizers of this wonderful conference. And it's always a pleasure addressing the audience and such a learned panelists at such a high-level conference. Today, I would be speaking on surgeries for small angle strabismus. So by convention, strabismus less than 10 to 15 prism diopters are known as small angle strabismus. They are more likely to cause asthenopic symptoms because when the two images are close together, the abnormal visual experience can be more bothersome. And in such cases, our normal conventional strabismus surgery may not give us the expected result, as there is a very high chance of overcorrection. Of course, non-surgical treatment like prisms and botulinum injections do have their role, but their use is limited. We would be focusing more on the surgical treatment. Probably the easiest and the most conventional method of correcting such strabismus would be the single muscle recession and resections. Recession of a single muscle medial rectus has been extensively studied, and they have been found to be safe and effective for small angle esotropias. Such a surgery may also be performed under topical anesthesia to reliably and effectively correct diplopia. Here, rather than recessions and resections, we would be focusing more on surgeries which have been specifically designed for small angle strabismus. So the first of these is the partial tenotomy, which was reintroduced by Dr. Alan Scott in the year 2000. So in this case, we are performing a partial tenotomy on the inferior rectus of a muscle having about 8 prism diopters of hypotropia with vertical diplopia. So after the patient has been sedated and the surgical field prepared, we inject about 1 to 2 ml of lignocaine into the subtenon space just adjacent to the lateral border of the inferior rectus muscle. The muscle is then hooked with a Stevens hook and replaced by a Jamison's hook. The conjunctiva and the tenons over the muscle is then dissected. So now the Jamison hook is holding the inferior rectus muscle. The anterior ciliary vessels are cauterized using a wet field diathermy. And now using a blunt Westcott scissors, about 2/3 of the lateral edge of the inferior rectus muscle is incised. Here we can see that the posterior end of the muscle slides back easily. In case if you feel you want more effect, you can snip a few more fibers of the inferior rectus muscle. So like I said, this was revisited by Alan Scott in the year 2000. It was extensively studied by Al Biglan, and he found that the average vertical deviation in primary gaze decreased from 8 prism diopters to 2 prism diopters. And in the field of action of the treated rectus muscle, it decreased from an average of 8 prism diopters to 3 prism diopters. It was also effective in reducing the number of patients having diplopia post-operatively and the number of patients who required prisms. It was also published by Scott Olitsky group. More recently, they performed this procedure in 9 subjects who had a preoperative deviation of around 5 diopters. Most of them were performed on the inferior rectus, and they found an average correction of around 4.67 prism diopters. The advantages of this procedure is that it is easy to perform. It can be done with under IV sedation and subconjunctival anesthesia. Intraoperative adjustments can be made. There is no need for suturing the muscle. Thus, a possible foreign body reaction is avoided. Because we are not passing a needle through the globe, there is no risk of penetration, very little chances of overcorrections. And if we don't get the desired effect, we can always convert it into a regular recession. The second procedure that we are going to look into is mini plication. So when a tightening procedure is needed for small deviations, the mini plication can be done. Here we are performing a mini plication on the lateral rectus for a small residual esotropia. After a swan incision is made over the lateral rectus muscle, the conjunctiva and the overlying tenons is dissected. The muscle is then lifted off the sclera with a tooth forceps, and a 6-0 vicryl suture is then passed through the middle 1/3 of the muscle belly. The muscle is then secured with the suture. The tenons, which is anterior to the insertion of the muscle, is dissected off so as to expose the sclera. And the needle of this 6-0 vicryl suture is then passed through the sclera about 1 to 2 millimeters anterior to the muscle insertion. And once the suture is tightened, the tied portion of the muscle comes anterior to the insertion, and this gives a strengthening effect. So Kenneth Wright studied this procedure and found that this reduced the vertical and horizontal deviations by an average of about 6.7 diopters. Advantages of this procedure are that it is less invasive and can be done with topical anesthesia. The third procedure that we are going to look into is the mini tenotomy. So it's a very simple procedure. We just hold the muscle through the intact conjunctiva, and once you are sure that you're holding nothing but the muscle, you incise the central 1/3 to 2/3 portion of the tendon, again through the intact conjunctiva. So by this, the central fibers of the muscle move back, and this gives a weakening effect. This again is a good procedure because it keeps the tendon poles intact, so the normal right rectus insertion is maintained, thus avoiding concomitance. So to summarize, all these procedures that we saw here are minimally invasive. Some of them can be done in the office with topical anesthesia, and they provide an alternative to prism glasses and conventional strabismus surgery. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. That was excellent. Especially like the videos and how well they were able to, see, show the procedure. The procedure is fairly simple, but planning for it is the difficult part. Dr. Kavita, would you like to comment, like, what is your preferred conjunctival incision for such procedures, and what is your experience with these small angle strabismus?
Experience is relatively low, but
Okay.
otherwise, if it's this much mini plications, 1 or 2 patients I have done, and I open the way sir has opened, like I open close
Swan.
to the muscle and the plication Swan's technique. But generally for my other surgeries, I prefer a limbal incision.
Okay, okay. So thank you. I think we'll move on to our last presentation of the session. It's none other than Dr. Kavita Kalevani.
Giving the best for the last.
Yes, and the topic as well. So like after we do the entire thing and we discuss everything, then we'll have to deal with the complications as well.
Yeah.
So Dr. Kavita is the right person to talk about it. She's a senior and experienced pediatric ophthalmologist from Shankar Nethralaya in Chennai. She has immense experience in handling pediatric cataracts, complex strabismus, name it, and she's done it. She was my teacher back when I was a fellow, and I truly enjoyed her effortless surgeries, and that's how I call it, just effortless and just precise surgeries. I would enjoy her surgical sessions as well, because there will always be music in the operation theater, and that's something I took back from her. Thank you, ma'am. She will be talking to us today about complications of squint surgery. Over to you. Over to you.
Thank you, Shruti, for such sweet words, and thank you, Hemalini, for this wonderful opportunity. So yeah, like Shruti says, as a strabismologist or as any surgeon, we don't escape what is called complication. So we define a complication as any undesirable and unwanted result of a procedure. So for strabismus, we can have complications at any point, intraoperatively, preoperatively even, and postoperatively. So preoperative, what I mean is not really complications. Very, very rarely, it should never happen. All these things should never happen ideally in our practice. A wrong patient, a wrong plan, wrong muscle, wrong anesthesia. In the sense, we sometimes think local anesthesia is sufficient, but the patient can become really uncooperative. So that maybe can be called as a wrong anesthesia. Otherwise, most complications are intraoperative or postoperative. So intraoperatively, again, these things should never happen. The wrong eye operating, sometimes you plan, you post, and then you have multiple surgeries. You may do a recess resect in another different eye or anything because the patient is under GA, you may not be sure. So these things should never occur. Otherwise, commoner complications intraoperatively we face is oculocardiac reflex. So as our anesthetists keep telling us, keep your ear open whenever you pull a muscle to the monitor. Bleeding, again, part and parcel of surgery. And scleral perforation is the most dreaded intraoperative complication, one of the most dreaded intraoperative complications. Again, it is avoidable if we take a lot of precautions while we operate. So other intraoperative complications can be muscle tearing or snapping, especially in situations where we have very tight or fibrotic muscles like thyroid ophthalmopathy. Like I said, similar situations, you can have a muscle slippage. Lost muscle is extremely rare, but it's a nightmare and one should never be facing it. Insufficient conjunctival closure sometimes can be a very nuisance, but it can happen. Buttonholing is a common thing that can happen. Corneal epithelial defects, sometimes incomplete irrigation, or sometimes instruments, or sometimes longer exposure can cause this. Otherwise, like I said, scleral perforation is a very common. Incidence is 0.13%. Recessions more commonly associated, obviously. Why? Because we do a scleral incision, scleral bites here. Larger recessions, because of difficult access, you can have more complications. Recti versus oblique, thinner sclera versus healthy sclera, spatulated needles more at risk. And complications of scleral perforations can be, if it is really deep or anything, can be retinal detachment, and it can act as a nidus to endophthalmitis. So prevention is now, with the advent of microscopic surgeries, it's very, very less compared to olden times. And hangback recessions, if you anticipate a large recession or a thin sclera, you can prefer hangback recessions, which avoids to a large extent this complication. And treatment is actually, the key is to identify when it happens, and it's useful to have a dilated pupil during your squint surgery as well. So a cryopexy or a laser, immediately managing the complication, really paves a long way to prevent complications. Muscle slip or loss. It's again a dreaded complication during intraocular, during the surgery. A slipped muscle rarely becomes not included in your suture, only the capsule gets included. So you get an empty capsule. So gentle train, when you identify it, you need to gently trace along the capsule. After the surgery, if you anticipate this, an MRI helps us to know whether the muscle is still attached to the sclera. As compared to this, a lost muscle, you have very peculiar classic features of tight or fibrotic muscle can be prone to get lost. It withdraws immediately into the orbit if it is already very tight, especially a medial rectus. An MRI differentiates this from a slipped muscle where the muscle is not found to be attached. So how do you differentiate a slipped muscle from a lost muscle? So preoperatively, this child has 30 prisms of ET, bimedial recession is done. And this is the postoperative picture, day 2, 40 prisms of exotropia, and adduction is clearly limited, -2 limitation of adduction. So immediately you need to treat by exploring, and if you're lucky enough, you can reattach the muscle. Here it is not a lost muscle because there is still some amount of adduction present. As compared to that, a lost muscle presents like this, more prone, like I said, are tight muscles, fibrotic muscles, medial rectus, since it doesn't have an intramuscular septum. A severe limitation is there. Lid retraction gives a clue. Treatment is again to try to explore and reattach, which is sometimes very difficult. Otherwise, you resort to other options. Postoperative complications, immediate. We can have loose knots of the conjunctiva, slippage, etc. Corneal abrasions and epithelial defects. It's always a good idea to see a patient whenever possible in a slit lamp in your post-op period also. Anterior segment ischemia is a very, very important immediate postoperative complication which you have to look for. Infection, cellulitis, suture abscess is not very common, but yes, you need to be looking for it. Necrotizing scleritis, very rare, but it is very devastating if you pick it up and if you're not able to pick it up. So again, you need to anticipate if you have a patient with the scleral issues prior to the surgery. And diplopia. So this is a granuloma. So anterior segment ischemia, how do you identify it? The risk, you do multiple recti in the same sitting, transposition procedures, previous buccal surgeries. Sometimes you can have absent recti, Graves, myopathy, radiation-related strabismus surgery. So all these exposed to high risk of anterior segment ischemia. Prevention is, of course, to stage your procedures, rule out systemic risk factors, vessel sparing procedures. So how does it present? It presents as a mild anterior uveitis with pain and photophobia. When you identify it, it's simple to manage. Relieving the cause sometimes may be necessary, but otherwise topical steroids and cycloplegic beautifully restores the condition. Later complications can be conjunctival cysts, suture granuloma, steroids and surgical removal may be necessary. Diplopia. So diplopia, do we really call it as a complication? Like immediately if a patient has diplopia, it's very, very common to have diplopia that time. It's usually transient and any type of strabismus patients can face it actually. When it is persistent, then we need to really worry about. So commonest reason for persistent diplopia can be under or overcorrection or a new misalignment which is induced by your surgery. So how do you prevent? So in any situation, anticipation is the first role of prevention. So any acquired sudden onset strabismus, nerve palsies, long-standing deviation, sensory strabismus, you have to anticipate diplopia and counsel the patient basically. A prism trial or adaptation helps. Counseling is of prime importance. Intractable diplopia. What is intractable diplopia? In cases where you have anisoconia or central fusion disruption, the diplopia can be persistent despite motor alignment. So this is also a risk that you have to anticipate and look for. It may be self-limiting most of the cases. Reassurance really helps. Prisms if not resolving, and resurgery if the angle is large. Occlusion if there is a central fusion disruption. So what are undesirable effects? Sometimes there may not be complications, but an ugly scar is undesirable. Palpebral fissure changes. Diplopia again, undercorrections, overcorrections are invariable, but undesirable. Recurrences can happen despite meticulous surgeries. So again, anticipation, meticulous assessment, preoperative good counseling, and adjustable surgery techniques helps to prevent some of these complications. And you patch, prisms, and surgery is necessary when you have a larger strabismus. So finally, strabismus management is really challenging, full of surprises despite a meticulous approach. Key is in anticipating, and patient counseling is of utmost importance. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Again, phenomenal talk, really nice. We've listed out everything. Just one thing, of late, I do see some of my juniors, or even I have seen one or two transient palsies following recessions surgeries. Have you had this particular complication, ma'am? Have you observed this in your, it's transient, but then it gets better with time. There is an abduction limitation, but then it improves.
Transient weakness, you mean?
Yes, like there is something like a paralysis component, or there is a limitation in the movement, which definitely improves with time. Yeah, it's almost like a -3 limitation, and then it kind of improves over time.
I don't know. Maybe the procedure that we do can have that, because last week I did one Faden, like Dr. Prakshi was saying, Faden on a medial rectus, and that I was not adducting till 3-4 days, and then gradually it improved. So we do see large recessions and large resections. There is a limitation of movement.
Also, you think it could be because of pain? The patient may be having a little pain and so not moving the eyes.
Possibly,
particularly large resections, or even pediatric patients, they just may not move the eyes because of the severe pain sometimes.
Okay, yeah,
that could be. In such situations, we should be careful if there is a new deviation. So, like for example, you do a medial rectus recession, and you find that medial rectus is not really moving, the eye is not adducting. But if there is no exotropia, then I think you're not having to worry too much. Like Dr. Hemalini said, maybe it's a pain which is limiting her to move the eye. But if there is an exotropia and the eye is not moving, then probably you have to really look more closely.
At a lost muscle or something.
Yeah. Yes. We have a question from Dr. Neena. PITS, how do you anticipate and tackle?
Sorry?
There is one more presentation in this session, no?
Okay.
Okay. Not that I was informed of, Dr. Parikshit.
No, ma'am, because it's there in the printed program. So.
Oh.
So we're running very late, then I think we'll skip this question and invite the next speaker, please.
Yes. So we'll have Dr. Rishikesh Mai with his next talk. He will be talking to us on vision assessment in specially abled children. Sir is from Nagpur, and he's a senior ophthalmologist who's very well known in the pediatric ophthalmic circles. Sir, thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thank you, Moscow. Thank you, Dr. Hemalini Madam and Parikshit Sir and Ragini Madam. I will, because we are running short of time. Actually, there was a reschedule of this talk into this session, which I came to know in the afternoon. So I'll just briefly elaborate on few aspects about visual assessment in specially able children. Visual assessment does not only include the checking for visual acuity, but also other parts of the visual status of the child. So visual development is extremely important for sensory motor development of the child, and visual stimulus accounts for almost 40% of sensory input in early life. As a result of which, if there is a poor visual status associated with poor motor development, and it also leads to delayed milestones. Visual development helps in better academic and vocational performance in children in later life. So even with children with special needs, they can also have a better academic life. And I know a few patients who have gone on to become engineers also. So due to priority in motor and allied problems in differently abled children, the visual development is usually neglected, because visual problems are not easily seen by parents as well as the treating physiotherapist or pediatric neurologist. So how do you start the visual assessment? There are certain principles which we need to follow. Is that there should be minimum waiting period, preferably if they call for appointment, which is not possible most of the times here in Nagpur. So if they call and fix an appointment, should be given in the early morning, and try to have a child-friendly atmosphere and try to minimize the waiting period of the child. So once the child comes to the outpatient, I usually tell my receptionist to send the patient directly into the room without going into the optometrist room, and we do a history, visual examination, and squint assessment. And if dilation is required, many of the times the patient has just come for a review or infections, we see the patient directly without making him wait for dilation. Many a times for follow-up, we don't do dilated diffraction. We just compare the previous reading with that of the previous reading with what we were now. So the normal visual functions are the visual acuity, visual field, and stereopsis, which we need to check. Now, among preferential looking charts can be used. Cardiff acuity is available, but I mean, it's comparatively more commonly available. It needs a bit of practice, but without just looking at the child also, we can come to know about the visual status of the child, especially what kind of vision the child might be having. Just if the child is able to follow the moving objects in all positions of gaze. The second part is what is the confrontation fields, which was described by Dr. Leah from Leah Symbols. You take a couple of objects, just two toys, ask the patient to keep looking straight and try to bring the object from periphery towards the center. If the child is able to follow in different while the moving object, probably the visual field in that particular gaze is good. As in this child, she had problems with up gaze, so at least now we are aware that her up gaze field is not as good. Depth perception, again, it is difficult using a Titmus fly if the child is severely spastic paraparetic. So just to check for the depth perception, you can ask the child to try to touch in something like a pen or pencil in the field, and as you can see that the superior field, which this child did not have a good visual field actually, she is trying to just pass point it, and she is not able to freely locate that particular the pen in that particular position. There are various theories. I will skip this part. There are certain leading questions which we need to ask to the parents. One is the what is the basic visual skills of the child has, whether the child is able to focus at objects, moving objects, and light. That will give you a clue about how much amount of vision the patient has. And also task-oriented visual skills, whether the child is able to identify familiar faces, whether he responds to the various facial expressions which we are giving, and also whether he is able to concentrate or just look at TV or computer screens once they are on. Simple resistance to occlusion can be tested in a child. If the child is able to resist occlusion in either eye, probably the vision is equal in both the eyes. So this is a simple test which can be applied for pre-verbal children or children with special needs, and also for central state maintained fixation. Like this child with exotropia in the right eye, the moment you close the left eye, he has got a nystagmoid movement in the right eye, so probably it is central, unsteady, and unmaintained in the right eye and maintained in the left eye. So many of the clinicians have tried to extrapolate this CSM vision into Snellen's acuity, but which is not very accurate. The only conclusion which we can draw is that the vision in the right eye is less than that in the left eye. So this is another child who had cerebral palsy, and she was just starting holding the neck. Remember, neck holding is very important for visual development, and you can see the nystagmoid movement, and the child is trying to look only in up gaze where she is able to perceive light. And after a couple of years, now she has a good neck holding, and she is able to look at the moving objects. So probably, though she has the nystagmoid movement is present, the vision is obviously delayed, but she has better vision than what she had in the previous visit. These are certain conclusions which you can draw just looking at the child itself. Visual evoked potential, it gives a better idea about the visual status of the child even in less than 1 year of age. So VEP, what we have here is flash VEP, but checkerboard is much better. We check the responses from the occipital cortex, not only especially we concentrate at the positive wave at 100 milliseconds, which gives us a better clue about whether there is any latency or reduction in amplitude of VEP. So we should have a tailor-made approach for visual problems in children, because once the visual status is known, we can actually decide on what kind of the visual field we are dealing with and what kind of visual status we are dealing with, and accordingly we can counsel the parents. Like if the patient is not able to look in lower field, the parents can be asked to be careful when the child is negotiating climbing the stairs up and down. Just a few statistical analysis from India. 26.8 million children have learning disability, and almost 29% are children less than 19 years of age. 76% have ocular problems, and the chances of having ocular problems, especially retinal and optic nerve diseases, are much more common in in children with special disabilities. The visual problems usually get neglected, especially in early childhood, in child with special needs, because of the neglect from the parents, from the physiotherapist, and even by the treating pediatrician. And children with these problems are interpreted as attention deficit or disobedient, instead of thinking that they might have visual problems as well. So visual health is very important for not only for the occupational part of it, but also for normal routine activities or day-to-day activities of the child. So with this, I would like to conclude that the chances of visual problem in differently able children are more, and almost 76% of them are reversible if they are treated at appropriate time. And visual development is important for sensory motor development of the child, and also to improve academic and vocational performance. With this, I would like to invite all of you for the 46th annual conference of VOS, which we are scheduled on 11th and 12th of December. It will be a physical conference. Thank you. Thank you, Maskan, for giving me an opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Perfect timing and excellent talk, and your videos were really nice. Thank you so much for helping us understand the nuances of testing vision in special children. I think we are a little short of time, so we will go on to the next session. Thank you all panelists, chairman, co-chairman, convener, Dr. Himalini, Dr. Parekh, for giving this wonderful opportunity, Dr. and Moscon. Over to the next session. Thank you so much all for joining in.